This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.
Hello, I'm Marcia Kavanaugh. Thanks so much for joining us. Well, in 1825, Governor Henry S. Johnson signed legislation creating a new parish for Louisiana. It would be named after the president who championed the Louisiana Purchase, Thomas Jefferson. In the following years, some of the original boundaries would be shifted. Part of what is now uptown New Orleans was originally part of Jefferson. Eventually, the present political divisions were created. The fledgling parish would include two distinctive sides divided by the Mississippi River, as well as suburban-style neighborhoods and several incorporated towns. This being the bicentennial year of Jefferson Parish, we present this special edition of Informed Sources as we look at the parish's history and politics, culture, and geography. In its 2 centuries, Jefferson Parish has evolved into a political and economic powerhouse. Its story is one worth exploring. At our table are Errol Laborde, producer of Informed Sources, Tony McAuley, staff writer, the Times-Picayune, the New Orleans Advocate, Robert Collins, Dillard University history professor and news commentator, and Richard Campanella, Tulane University geographer and author. We're going to go over to Richard first because talking about Jefferson Parish, it has certainly a certain geography about it and form. And then also I'd like to find out from you, how is it settled? You know, the settlement pattern.
Right. Let's start out with political geography. Why was this created? Okay. Sure. And it was carved out on February 11th, 1825, out of the western half of Orleans Parish at a time when the city of New Orleans, the incorporated city of New Orleans, was a pretty small footprint, Felicity Street down to Marigny. Everything else was unincorporated, but there were valuable plantations along the natural levee. The sugar planters there felt that urban New Orleans had all the power. They had the capital, they had political power, economic power, cultural power. There was a growing Anglo population there. The sugar planters were mostly Francophone Creoles. And so in order to keep some power to their self, the way to do that is to get the state legislature to designate a separate parish. They have their own police jury, they have their own representation. So it came out of that. And to look at the underlying physical geography here, you have 2 sides of the river, and it is a perfect profile on both sides of the higher, valuable, arable natural levee, going back to Back Swamp, and going back to saline marshes and a tidal lagoon. On the east side, it's on the north, it is Lake Pontchartrain, and on the west side to the south, it is Lake Salvador, then the Barataria Basin. Mm-hmm. And that speaks to the settlement patterns and the economies. You could only live on the higher ground. And so what you saw along West Jeff and the West Bank in general was the emergence of, I describe it as kind of a necklace of villages connected along the river, plantations to the rear, and you have a fishing economy and wild game or natural resource extraction to the Barataria Basin, roughly the equivalent thing on the East Bank. There's also 2 ridge systems that complicate this. On the East Bank is the Metairie Ridge, the Metairie meaning these little farmsteads. It's a narrow ridge. It's above the level of the swamps. Just enough room, not really for plantations, but these small sort of truck farms, pastures, things like that. On the West Bank, it's Bayou Familles, which provides the same phenomena there. These would play a role hydrologically later on in the era of drainage, because they separated out separate drainage watersheds that could be drained separately. To the question of settlement, the settlement is on the higher ground and it emanated outwardly from the city of New Orleans. Okay, you have these rural enslaved plantations, but where you actually see urban settlement quite logically, is the closer you get to New Orleans. So these places also wanted their own political power and representation, and so they incorporated. So we're talking about a sliver of the Irish Channel Garden District in Central City. That becomes the Jefferson Parish city of Lafayette in 1833. Next one over is from Toledano to Lower Loin Street. That becomes the borough of Freeport, a rare use of the term borough here, which is very English. Freeport, that becomes the city of Jefferson. And then the city of Carrollton, okay? And so what happens from 1852 to 1874 is New Orleans has much more clout, and it kind of savors all this high ground. It doesn't like the competition. They have their own ports, right? And so it gets the state legislature to almost do hostile takeovers. And so they annexed Lafayette, about 50-50 support there in 1852. The Jefferson annexation comes in some ugly Reconstruction era politics. That happens in 1870, and then the very last of it is Carrollton in 1874. So the result of this is that even as Jefferson Parish was growing in every other way, it actually loses population during those decades. Not because it's losing population, but because it's losing land.
Yeah. Yeah, losing those towns. So that was not done, quite favorably by everybody then. There was some consternation about those towns going.
Correct. This was before, see now, if a place wants to annex adjacent, the citizens have to sign off on it through a referendum. That wasn't the case then. And so the political clout of the city was able to just overwhelm the ability of Jefferson to keep them at bay.
Wouldn't it have been natural to make the West Bank its own parish?
Well, here's the thing. If you look at most of the parishes on the lower river, many of them actually straddle the river. And each of them wanted to give an even slice of that whole deltaic profile. If you created a parish that was exclusively natural levee, that would be too valuable, and it would mean another parish would be exclusively back swamp. But the answer to your question is that because the pre-existing parish of Orleans straddled both, then divvying it right down the middle, the western half becomes Jefferson, proved to be the easiest solution.
And of course, Grand Isle is part of Jefferson Parish too, so the parish stretched all the way to Gulf.
And that surprises a lot of people, but it really shouldn't, because if you look at most of the other parishes, as I like to put it, they flail. They flail from the river all the way out to the perimeter. The Wrigley's, right? Lake Catherine, that's in urban New Orleans. So again, that profile meant Grand Isle ended up in Jefferson.
So the population of Jefferson Parish, sort of describe what kind of people live there in the early years of Jefferson Parish?
Okay, well, there was a very substantial enslaved population who become emancipated. Many of them stay there. Others migrate to urban New Orleans. There's the planter population, and the population in Jefferson Parish rises steadily in spurts from 1880 to 1980. And it starts in the low 10,000s, then it breaks 100,000, and by 1980, at the peak of the oil boom, it's like 450, 480, check me on that. And the major surge there, if you look at the 20th century, reclamation, which is that first stage of swamp drainage, begins in Kenner and Metairie in the 1910s. And over the next decade, as airline is widened and you have all these new arteries, reclamation turns into actual subsurface drainage, and that makes it livable, okay? You have, right after World War II, you have these new arteries, you have the GI Bill, you have white flight, and there's decline in the urban core and more movement out to the periphery. And so you really see a boom in families. The children's population is booming. It's very majority white. And this is the case up until the late 20th century and early 21st century, where we actually see a leveling off and a decline in the population, as sort of the similar forces that led to the rise are now leading to a departure to places like the North Shore.
This has all just been fascinating. You could go on for another hour with us, but we have to move on. Let me go over to Robert right now. Let's talk a little bit, just touch on what the demographics are of the parish today. As Richard was referring to, there is some, decline in the population, but it's still one of the largest parishes in the state, right?
Sure. Well, the most recent Census Bureau estimates have the population of Jefferson Parish at 421,000 777, compared to New Orleans, which is 364,136. So it's a lot bigger than Orleans Parish. It's a big, powerful parish over there.
And East Baton Rouge is bigger than both of them.
Exactly. Exactly.
And so, what is the breakdown of the parish?
Okay, so the breakdown is the black population of the parish is about 118,000. Well, the actual estimate is 118,941, and that's about 28% of the population.
Okay, and I know you wanted to touch on and politics too, on the politics of the parish, particularly black politics.
Sure. So the oldest black neighborhood in Jefferson Parish is a place called Walkertown, which is in Marrero on the West Bank. It was founded by a woman named Corrine Degree Walker. She purchased the land in 1921, had 12 children, and all of her 12 children, when they became adults, they bought houses and they settled in the area, and so they had their own neighborhood, and that area sort of grew from there. Now, what's interesting about Marrero and that area about there, it's not, even today, it's not a large area. It's a census tract of about 33,000 people, about half of those, 16,000 are black. But it's interesting politically because most of the Jefferson Parish politicians tend to come from in or around Marrero. And interestingly enough, if you look at the redistricting of the area, all of the black politicians, they always make sure that section of Marrero is in their district. So both of the members of the Black Caucus that represent the area in the State House of Representatives, Lyons and Green, their section of is they represent Marrero. The state senator, Joseph Bowie, he represents a section of Marrero, and even Troy Carter, his congressional district jumps over the river right there and actually represents that area of Marrero. So Marrero is sort of this politically magical place that, and also the only black majority district on the Jefferson Parish Council, which is currently held by Byron Lee, also represents Marrero. So it's just sort of a politically magical place for black politics. Now when we think about black politics in Jefferson Parish, it's important to keep in mind it's more complex for black politicians in Jefferson Parish simply because they never had the numbers that, say, the Orleans Parish black politicians have. I mean, the black population of Orleans is about 56, 57%. It's about the exact estimate is 57.6 in the last estimate. Of course, Jefferson Parish, the black population's only about 28%. So what the black politicians have had to do is that historically they've been very strategic in teaming with civil rights lawyers using the Voting Rights Act of 1965 to basically create specific majority black districts where they had a fair opportunity of winning those seats. But even with those challenges, we see a lot of politicians we see a lot of parallels between the black politics in New Orleans and the black politics in Jefferson Parish. Of course, we know Dutch Morial was elected the first black mayor in New Orleans in 1977. In 1979, the city of Kenner elected its first black city council person. The schools were desegregated in Jefferson Parish right around the same time that they were desegregated in Orleans Parish. There's a case called Dandridge v. Jefferson Parish School System, which was started in 1964. There's a lot of parallels between the desegregation of the Orleans Parish schools and the desegregation of the Jefferson Parish schools. And so right around this time, we saw the emergence of black politics in Jefferson Parish. It probably didn't get the same amount of national press that Orleans Parish did, because obviously the media tends to focus on Orleans. But there are a lot of interesting parallels between black politics in New Orleans, black politics in Jefferson Parish, which were happening at the same time. But I think black politics in Jefferson Parish, much more so than Orleans Parish, is really characterized by this very strategic effort of civil rights lawyers to latch on to the Civil Rights Act of to latch on to the Voting Rights Act of 1965 and to file lawsuits and to say that, you know, we don't have a shot at getting elected unless we file these lawsuits, and either the courts or the state legislatures, the courts require the state legislature to create specific black majority districts where we have, you know, at least 50% of the population that's black, so we have a fair opportunity at winning those races.
Okay, E, let's go on over to you and talk about other politics and politicians in Jefferson Parish.
Well, first, structurally, Jefferson Parish is interesting compared to Orleans. Here you have two parishes side by side, Orleans and Jefferson. Orleans Parish and the city of New Orleans are the same thing as far as the governance. They have the same legislative body, the same chief executive. Some offices are technically considered to be parish offices, but really it's one government there. There's only one incorporated city in Orleans Parish, and that's the city of New Orleans. In Jefferson Parish, it's a parish, but there are 4 different incorporated cities in there. There's Gretna, there's Harahan, there's Kenton, there's Westwego, plus there are 2 what are considered to be towns, and that's Grand Island, Jane Lafitte. And then there are other things that are post office designations like River Ridge. A lot of people think there's a mayor of Metairie. Okay, so a lot of people look for, you know, for the Metairie City Hall. It doesn't exist. Okay, that Metairie doesn't have its own government. It's just a place name. But there's a lot of government. I mean, if you live in Kenton or Harahan, you have 2 sets of council members. You have 2 sets of, you got a mayor and then you got a parish president and you got the council. And so it's a lot of, it's very complex as far as governmentally. Through the years, the evolution of the politics in the early days when it was more of a scattered rural parish, you had the old police jury system. By the 1970s in Jefferson Parish, they developed the parish president council system, which is very much like the New Orleans system, which is a mayor council system. You have your chief executive, you have 7 council members, 5 represent districts, and 2 are at large, and so they're almost exactly alike. And so the politics is kind of like determined within that framework. But that was a period, I think, from like the 60s to maybe the late 70s into the 80s, where you had some real rival factions. A power force for a long time in Jefferson Parish was the sheriff. You know, the sheriff was, whoever the sheriff might be, the sheriff was a parish-wide official. Sheriff is not only the jailer, he's also the tax collector. And that's a big power base. And then also the assessor, and especially as you're getting more and more homeowners, and property tax, and all that becomes more and more of an issue. We saw some powerful assessors, Lawrence Shahardy, the most in the Louisiana Constitution of '73. He chaired the committee about property tax. Okay, and so really Jefferson Parish really wrote, you know, the current homestead exemption law. So that's very forceful. But you had one faction for a long time. There was a parish president named Tom Donlan, the former mayor of Harahan. And he and the sheriff, Alvin Cronfitch, and the state senator, Jules Molaire, were one group known as the DCM, and then you had Shahardy's group. And so this was, we didn't have Democrats versus Republicans. We had DCM versus Shahardy. And for many years, the politics was controlled like that. Ultimately, that broke down and things moved on. It's not that stratified as it used to be, but it used to be a lot different. And those are pretty powerful battles that they had in those days.
Definitely. And so also with all of these, you know, different battles, political battles going on, the population shifts and growth and laws, there was also business growth too, particularly let's sort of focus on post-World War II, the business growth in Jefferson Parish. I can remember as a Jefferson Parish resident growing up in Jefferson Parish, part of that boom after World War II, the GIs buying homes and suburban growth of Lakeside Shopping Center opening up. That was just such a major event, and we were all so excited about that. So let's take a look at, you know, what business is like now, has been in Jefferson Parish, and where it's going.
Well, as Richard was indicating, at the end of the 19th century, so the first 80 years of the parish existence, the big fortunes would have been made by you know, agrarian business, cotton, rice, and then timber development as well. One of the big fortunes was made by timber production and also manufacturing. But of course, the river plays a huge role in any kind of economic development of the parish. And after the discovery of oil in 1901, a couple of decades later, it was really starting to take off, and that drives a lot of what happens economically. as then you move up through the 30s, you know when you get the beginnings of Avondale, it starts off as driven by that kind of economic pull with barges and that sort of thing. But the Second World War really turbocharges the economy in general, and you can see that through Avondale, which started to get all of the naval contracts, and became eventually one of the biggest employers in the state, the biggest employer in the state after during and after the war. But what you're also seeing though is the development of the petrochemical business, which the still legacy of that in the parish, and also in the post-war, what's a huge driver of development is the house building that you referred to. There's some what was driving that also was the infrastructure. We start to get before the war, we start to get the Huey P. Long Bridge being built, and then after the war, we get the extension of I-10 and the Earhart Expressway. And then, there's with the two big industries there, you get a lot of smaller manufacturing. You had about 2,000 individual manufacturing industries that existed in the parish in that post-war period. But then there's decline of both those industries, shipbuilding and petrochemicals, and other industries had to come along and kind of take their place. So, and there's also a series of natural disasters, of course, culminating with Katrina, but also the BP oil spill, and then most recently the pandemic. So the diversity of the economy, much like Orleans Parish, has been a priority really since the decline of the oil industry. I think that's really when the parish started to focus on that from an economic development point of view. So what you have seen more recently in terms of growth industries is the healthcare sector. We've got two big players in that sector in the parish, which you've seen expanding in recent years, Ochsner and LCMC Health. You've seen the food business, then, which is very much a focus of what they call a cluster. Is the buzzword in economic development, developing clusters. So you've got businesses most recently, like in the old Avondale, for example. You've got Fuji Oil and Bunge Oil. These are food oil replacing the old petro oil businesses to some extent. But also then you've got what they're trying to develop is the new energy sector. So you've got a Japanese company coming into what had been an old plantation, then is a petrochemical complex, and now they're trying to move into the new energy industry that's on the West Bank with the development of EV batteries. And then the other cluster that they're focused on is they're looking to develop that industrial park down down south of Avondale, which will be a new incubator for the food business, where like Riley Foods, Camellia Beans, some of these old line companies are.
And retail remains strong in Jefferson Parish too. I mean, I mentioned Lakeside, and Lakeside Shopping Center is, one of the few strong malls remaining in the United States.
Well, Lakeside is an outlier, for the states and regionally, in that it has remained pretty robust, even though it hasn't tried to recreate itself with these experiential things, as they call it, which in fact Clearview, just down the road, is in the midst of doing. So, taking up that theme of the medical, they've replaced Sears with an Ochsner Center. They've built some apartments on land that in that complex. They've put in kind of a drive-through food, and the next stage of that will be to recreate the center of that into one of these sort of entertainment, building off the AMC theater there. Esplanade hasn't found that's still kind of a ghost mall, but that's Elmwood is also another one that's reinventing itself.
It has, been dynamic growth. I know the leaders are looking to grow it even more, and to bring people to live into Jefferson Parish, to work into Jefferson Parish. So what I want to ask you guys right now is, Could you name a couple of people who really stand out over the history of Jefferson Parish? Start with you, Ian.
Okay, well, Dr. Alton Oxner, who just, of course, developing the hospital, the medical complex, and the Oxner presence in Jefferson Parish is just enormous, not to mention all the work he did in healthcare, so very important person. Somebody a totally different category is Lloyd Price, who was a rhythm and blues and rock and roll entertainer from Kenner, and he had a big hit. It was the top 10 hit nationwide called Personality,
Right.
another one called Stagger Lee and Lottie Lottie, Miss Claudie. And if you go on YouTube, you can find a YouTube of Lloyd Price performing on an old Ed Sullivan show. And it's
right.
worth watching. He was really good.
All righty, Tony, over to you.
I would say the father-son Lapairs, who own a company called Latrim, and the father is a prolific inventor and held many patents. But and then the son was one of those rare examples of a second-generation company leader who took the company and really expanded it. They're a world leader in something that's kind of unsexy, but they're conveyor belts and equipment like that. But they're basically the kind of guts behind Amazon, for example. So they're a real economic
very
powerhouse in
important, yeah.
Jefferson Parish.
All right, Tony, thanks. Robert.
My two people are Donald Jones, who in 1991 was the first black parish council member to be elected to the Jefferson Parish Council, and my second person is Lionel Collins, who was lead counsel in the desegregation case to integrate the schools in Jefferson Parish, and then later in 1984 was elected parish-wide to a judgeship and became the first black person elected parish-wide in Jefferson Parish.
All right, over to you, Richard.
Louise Harvey inherited the Destrahan Canal, and had the foresight in 1898 to turn it into a family-owned company. And that family later on beat out the Barrow family of the Company Canal in landing the core contract to become the Gulf Intracoastal Waterway. That's why we all know the Harvey Canal, and we no longer know the Company Canal. Another one would be George Hero, Swedish-born, 1855, makes a mint in the cotton industry. Early 1900s, he retires to the task of drainage, and he becomes known as the Drainage King, and almost single-handedly pulled off the drainage of the West Bank and West Jeff Back Swamp.
Wow. Great information, guys. Learned a whole lot. Thanks a lot for joining us here, and thank you all for watching. Have a good evening.
This program is brought to you in part by the Eugenie and Joseph Jones Family Foundation, a local foundation proud to support education, the arts, and culture in the greater New Orleans area.